Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics, and this is the Holosun 507K. There's been an explosion in the number of options that are available for red dots on handguns. One category that has been somewhat lacking is a category of optics that are for subcompact guns. And while something that's that small can be put on something larger, it's more intended for the smaller guns such as the Glock 48, the SIG 365, similar size subcompact slimline single stack, what have you. Even the more venerable but somewhat older guns such as like the Glock 26 or your HK P2000 SK or what have you. They generally have a smaller overall profile, which means you're going to have a smaller overall footprint on your optic in order to easily adapt the optic to the gun, especially in the case of the single stack guns like the Glock 48. Glock 48 was something that was somewhat interesting to me, a passing interest if you will, but it didn't really appeal to me in the fact that there wasn't an easy way to put a red dot on it. And while there are options to mount full-size, what I consider full-size red dot sights to it, such as the RMR or the Delta Point, or what have you, they don't really fit the size of the slide. And like I said, the subcompact type optics, or these smaller, what I'd consider to be a micro red dot sight, options weren't really there. There are a couple out there, but this is the first offering of a smaller subcompact size optic from Holosun. Of course, the real question is going to be, how is it going to compare to other optics? Now, you know me, I don't do comparison reviews. I like each product to stand on its own merits. Of course, I'll be willing to answer the question if it comes up in conversation or in a class, but generally when I do a review video, I just talk about the specifics and I try to keep the comparisons to a minimum, if at all. What we're getting with the 507K is a very slim footprint with a side load battery powered by a 1632. The 507K has a 2 MOA main dot with an optional 32 MOA circle, so you can have their segmented reticle, more of it, and a lot of people liken it to the EOTech style reticle, which is, it's very similar. So I've got a dot in the middle, got a circle around the side, gives me a lot of options. I do like that reticle on pistol optics, especially for newer shooters, because it gives you a little bit more of a chance when you're first developing your skill of picking up that dot on the draw stroke to acquire your reticle without having to look for it. And there's a lot of course technique that goes into that to kind of minimize your chances or damn near eliminate your chances of not picking up your reticle on the draw stroke. But if you're just getting into shooting, having that option is great. For the 507K, it's great that you can turn it off. You are getting a substantially smaller window, but one thing you are gaining, and something that a lot of people ask for, is the ability to use an optic with traditional height sights, which is something the 507K is going to give us. Of course, it all depends on how your gun is set up. If you go with a milled footprint and the person knows what they're doing, which hopefully you'll send your gun to a reputable aftermarket shop to do your milling work, you're going to get a traditional height sight option. In this case, on my Glock 48, this is an Agency Arms. Agency Arms did the aftermarket work to this. They also milled it for the 507K. I'm using Trijicon fiber optics as my backup sights, but I'm able to use the optic in conjunction with those sights without needing to get suppressor height sights or anything like that. So that's a very big feature. For some people, they're going to prefer that. Personally, not something I really need, not something I'm really looking for. However, with an optic like this, with the window as small as it is, relatively speaking, you definitely will want to use traditional height sights anyway. Now, in preparing for this review, I kind of had to ask myself a question. Am I going to put an optic that, for all intents and purposes, is not designed for duty use? Am I going to put it through the same review process that I put every optic through? My main reasoning for this is my duty optic schedule of testing, if you will. If you're not familiar, just go watch any other RDS video I've ever done, and it covers it. Is a little bit more rigorous than what I would consider you to reasonably expect performance-wise for a optic that I would really relegate to the category of concealed carry. It's not something I would put on a duty gun. It's not something that is intended for a duty gun. That doesn't mean you can't put it on a duty gun. But it's not intended for a duty gun. Holosun has been pretty clear about that with the 507K, but that doesn't mean you can't use it for plainclothes duty if that's something you want to do. And because the Glock 48 exists, and now that there's aftermarket magazine options for it that increase the capacity, so you've got the Shield Arms S15 mags, which take the Glock 48 up to a standard capacity of 15 rounds, which puts it right smack dab in the exact same category as a Glock 19, which has been a very popular duty gun with certain agencies for detectives and non-uniform individuals, and even some departments authorize it for uniform use for officers that have smaller hands, which is awesome. So the Glock 48 exists, and it can kind of fit into that same category. They're not exactly the same gun for obvious reasons. The 48 does have a little bit more snap to it on the recoil because the gun has less mass, but that gives you an option there. So I don't foresee the 507K becoming a duty optic. However, there are other optics out there that aren't intended for duty optics that people are attempting to use on duty, and they may or may not be successful, and of course I hope they are, but the optics weren't intended for that purpose. So the question became, was I going to put the 507K through the same regimen that I put every other optic through, even though it's pretty clear and stated by the manufacturer that it's not supposed to be a duty optic? And I figured, you know what the hell, let's do it. Of course, one exception to that, I'm not going to do a burn down. There will be no burn down in this review, and my main reason for that was I'm not going to buy 500 rounds worth of magazines for the Glock 48, and I don't know enough people who have Glock 48s. It would just be a logistical nightmare for me to borrow all the magazines that I would need in order to do that 500 round burn down. So that's one exception to this review process. That being said, I did run the gun very, very hard as I could with the magazines I had available to me throughout the review process. When we're looking specifically at the optic, but I was using almost exclusively the Shield S15 magazine and their S15 magazine extension, which gives me 20 rounds of capacity. So from a carry standpoint, it turns the 48 from an occasional gun. For some people, it's going to be an everyday carry kind of thing because you're getting the same capacity, same barrel length, same overall performance as far as accuracy is concerned that you're going to get from a Glock 19. Now, getting right into the features of the 507K, as I already said, it's powered by a 1632 side load battery. It also has the adjustments on the opposite side of the body. That body itself is 7075 T6 aluminum. This is kind of a departure for Holosun, the fact that this optic does not have the solar panel, so you don't have the dual power option that you get from some of their other optics, and I think the main reason for that was just footprint was not going to allow for that kind of technology to be introduced. Lens size is smaller, comparable to other optics are out there, but like I said, this is kind of a different category of optic. It's a micro red dot sight, and that's something that we definitely have to appreciate when we're looking at its overall performance. The two reticle option, you've got the 2 MOA main dot, which is what I used throughout the review process. Even though I had the option of using the 32 MOA circle, I found like just for my personal preference, it busied up the window too much for me to really like it. So I just went with the 2 MOA dot throughout the review process. Now, as I said, I was going to put this through the exact same process that I put normal optics through, which includes manipulation testing. Use the optic body itself to work the slide on the gun, which is not something I advocate unless you absolutely have to. So when I teach red dot specific classes, or really any classes in regards to the handgun, there'll be a time at some point in the instruction where we have to talk about how do I manipulate the slide on the handgun if I only have one hand available. With an optic mounted on a handgun, it makes it very easy to do that because you have a more substantial ledge to gain leverage and work that slide if you need to reload, close a slide, clear a malfunction, something like that. The way I usually test that is I just introduce dummy rounds into my magazines during my normal shooting practice, and one-handed stuff, anytime I get a failure to fire, I'm able to tap, rack, get the gun back to work. That's something I've done. I figure that to be basic level operation stuff. Another cool feature, if you're interested with the 507K, is it does have a built-in rear sight. rear notch, if you will. It's shallow and it's very wide, and depending on the way the gun is set up, you may or may not need it. So on the 48, there's plenty of room left over with the milling to keep a traditional rear sight. So for me, there was absolutely no reason to use that notch. But it can be a rear sight notch if that's something you need based on the footprint you have available to you. I can't think of a gun that would need that with proper milling done. There's usually more than enough room behind the rear hammer or the striker plate and the breech face to fit an optic and still retain that rear sight. But if you find yourself in a situation, or maybe you found a gun, maybe you've just got the hipsterest of hipster subcompact guns, that there just isn't enough room, you have an option. You can take the rear sight off the gun, let it be milled off the gun, if you will, and you can still retain a rear sight with the 507K body. That being said, it's going to give you a very vague rear sight compared to a traditional rear notch. I was initially a little hesitant, being like, okay, I got to drop test this thing, because another part of my testing is every 500 rounds, I'm going to do a shoulder height drop test on a hard surface, generally concrete, flagstone, or something similar. Doing it in the dirt or the grass just doesn't have the same overall effect. And of course, the disclaimer for that drop test, as always, is that's not because I feel like people are going to be dropping their guns from shoulder height. It's to give me a uniform simulation of the optic taking sudden shock from impact, be it a drop or hitting against a door frame, or in some cases, at least in regards to a duty optic, think about a holstered handgun taking a hard impact on the ground as someone goes to the ground to kind of scuffle around with someone. There actually have been duty optics worn by police officers that during altercations that went to the ground, the officer rolled over it and had combined body weight placed on top of the holster, and it actually broke the optic in the holster. And this is why I do this. Some people just can't get that through their heads, but that's exactly why it is, and this is my testing, not yours. So I was going to do a drop test every 500 rounds on the 507K. Got a spin out of it that time. After every drop, I checked the zero to see if it maintained zero. I'm happy to report that the 507K made it through all 4 drops for this 2,000 rounds. As I'm filming this, I'm going to continue to evaluate it, but at this point of the video, 2,000 rounds, made it through all 4 drops without significant damage, or damage that prevented the optic from functioning. There is a small delamination crack in one corner of the window, which happened on the second drop, but it's not that big of a deal because the optic is still good. Now, of course, the question is it still zeroed? Well, here's a 5-round group I shot at the zero distance of 25 yards prior to the first drop test. And here's a 5-round group after the final 4th drop test. So as far as durability goes, zero was maintained throughout those 4 drops. And I was, of course, shooting 124 grain gold dot, which is my preferred go-to 9mm ammo for defense purposes. Also what I use for almost any zero confirmation I'm going to do for video purposes. Now, I think it's worth mentioning that this optic, which is by manufacturer not intended for full-size guns, not intended for duty guns, they put it in the subcompact category, just made it through 2,000 rounds of my testing schedule. And there are optics that are full-size marketed for duty guns that couldn't do that, which is telling. Now, would it have made it through if I'd put it on a full-size gun? Don't know, but it's not for full-size guns. It's not ideal, it's not intended, it's not imagined for the full-size handgun, even though you can put it on there if that's what you want to do, but that's not what its intended purpose is. But the telling part, of course, is the fact that it made it through 2,000 rounds, 4 shoulder height drops, 2,000 rounds throughout the review process, and there's other optics that are larger in footprint but more intended for robust duty use, and maybe they even use kind of that kind of verbiage, if you will, in their advertising, and those optics didn't make it through the testing process. So as far as where I set my goalposts at, the Holosun 507K sailed right through them. I did expect going into it to not really care for the smaller window. And I know you can't have it both ways. You can't have a subcompact optic that's going to be tailored for slimline or compact guns and not lose a little bit of your width or your window size. I'm not so much worried about the width of a window as I am about the height of a window, because I like to be able to keep my dot in the window during recoil whenever possible. So me, when I shoot two-handed, When I've got a proper two-handed grip on the gun, it's very rare, if ever, for my dot to leave the window and recoil. On the 507K, that's not the case because I've got a smaller window overall, and the 48 relative to other size guns that have more mass to them, a little bit more snappy. So I was losing my dot, which is something that was slightly aggravating, but it has nothing to do with my technique. It's just the physics of the size of the gun and the smaller window. That being said, being able to use a more traditional indexing for people who are interested in that, if you're already kind of geared for iron sights, it's going to be very easy for you to start to acquire this dot because the iron sights look right through the window. It's co-witness, if you will, which is a term that some people like to use. The iron sights co-witness through the window of the 507K. So if you're new to red dots, this is actually going to help you out a lot. It'll make it easier for you to pick up that dot consistently because you can still get away with using the old iron sight technique for sight alignment in order to acquire your dot, which is not optimal. It's not something we should be doing because it does slow you down visually just a little bit, and it does add to a little bit of visual confusion, but it's better than having to force hack it, if you will, using more traditional suppressor height sights with the dot. So I guess from an ease of use standpoint, the 507K lends itself very well also, in addition to what we already talked about, to newer shooters to the red dot. Overall impressions of the 507K, I like it. It's not something that I would be necessarily attracted to because I don't carry subcompact guns, even though now with the Glock 48 I have an aftermarket magazine option to get capacity up to 15 rounds. I can get away with concealing a full-size handgun, so that's what I'm going to carry. Even when I need to wear a suit for some reason, I generally just wear a three-piece suit so I can still carry a full-size handgun because the vest becomes my method of concealment. So it's not a gun that I'm going to carry, which means this isn't an optic I'm going to use. That being said, if for whatever reason I had to carry a subcompact or a slimline gun, and I'm going to put an optic on it, and this is the optic I would put on it. This is a very small category of optics that are out there, and now we actually have an optic that's kind of tailored for the subcompact or slimline handgun category that's actually worth the money you're going to pay for it. Of course, there's other options out there, but of the ones I've looked at, none of them, well, made it this far in the review process, and none of them offered the same features, performance, or durability as the 507K. I consider, for me personally, it's kind of a niche category, but there's a lot of shooters out there that want to carry the 43X, or want to carry the 48, or want to carry the SIG 365. And now you have a very viable option as far as optics are concerned to be able to maintain red dots on that subcompact handgun, because a lot of people, they're like, I'm going to carry a subcompact handgun, I can't get a bigger red dot on it, so I'm going to have to forgo the red dot and just go back to iron sights, which is completely the wrong answer. We don't want to go backwards in time. Now we don't have to worry about that. Ultimately, is the 507K worth it? If you need a micro red dot sight, the answer is yes. It's the best one currently on the market that I'm aware of everything I've tested, and I generally test almost every single red dot that comes along, and this is a category I'll be testing as well. It might be a little unfair, I guess, to test it to the duty standards because it's not intended for that, but you can't have it both ways, right? So I wasn't going to create an entirely separate category of testing for concealed carry or non-duty rated red dots, because then we get into the completely nebulous possible arguments of what is duty, what is not duty, which optic should be duty, which optic shouldn't be duty. I'm not going to get into all that. So I'm going to test things based on one standard, and hopefully everything makes it through. And even if it hadn't, of course the disclaimer could have been made that, well, it wasn't intended for duty use, so it's probably not going to be as robust based on the limitations of the size that they had available or what they were trying to do with the footprint. But it did. So it made it through the initial 2,000 round process. I'm still going to continue testing it using my schedule. So even after the video ends on any optic I do, and some optics I will provide an update in the future. I've done that on optics in the past. When I hit 10,000 rounds and so on and so forth, I'll provide an update. But the testing continues, the schedule continues. So every time I go to the range, this gun's coming with me. It's going to get rounds through it. It's going to get used in classes. Students are going to borrow it and run it through a 2,000 round course of fire or what have you. But it's going to continue to get those drop tests, continue to get the rounds down range, and we'll see long-term viability, how well the 507K is able to do. But for right now, after that 2,000 rounds, I would be perfectly comfortable and confident carrying this on a subcompact gun. So I'd have that red dot option on those smaller guns where historically there were red dots that existed, but none of them were any good. So this is now a good, solid, viable option if you want a slimline dot that has the co-witness ability. So the too long didn't read, I guess, part of this video is if you're looking for an optic for a slimline or subcompact handgun, you want something that's got a really uniform footprint with the dimensions of that particular firearm, you don't really need to look any further than the Holosun 507K. I would highly recommend it for any of those concealed carry subcompact slimline guns. For duty purposes, I would still stay away from it because it's not really geared, intended, or designed for that. But as you saw, it made it through the same process that a lot of other optics failed. And I think that's very telling of the engineering and the redesign that's gone into some of the Holosun products moving forward. Quality has definitely continued to improve with their product line, and this optic is no exception. I'm Aaron Count with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.